Can we understand the classics without the classroom? If you already know why we should preserve ancient history, philosophy, and literature, perhaps it's time to ask how, and how you can help. What resources are available? Where can we begin? And how can we find the time? This special Classical Wisdom Speaks episode features Harvard professor Dr. James Hankins and Alexandra Hudson, curator of Civic Renaissance. We discuss how we can find the humanities outside institutions.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anya Leonard. I'm the founder and director of Classical Wisdom. And for those of you who are new to Classical Wisdom, we are a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Our goal is to promote and preserve the classics while illustrating the relevancy of ancient history, literature, and philosophy in our here and now. And we do so through our newsletters, ebooks, podcasts called Classical Wisdom Speaks, and events such as these. So today I'm joined with Dr. James Hankins, professor of history at Harvard University and an intellectual historian specializing in the Italian Renaissance. He is the general editor of the Itati Renaissance Library, which aims to be the Italian Renaissance version, the younger sister of the Loeb Classics Library. James is also the author of many excellent books, including his latest, Virtue, Politics, Soulcraft, and Statecraft. And before I turn you over to my co-host, Alexandra Hudson, who will be acting as our moderator today, I'd like to just have a quick note to say that we will be addressing questions at the end. But in the meantime, please feel free to write in as you go, as ideas pop into your mind, and we will endeavor to answer as many as we can. So without further ado, I will pass you on to the curator of Civic Renaissance, Alexandra Hudson.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alexandra Hudson, and I'm thrilled that so many of you have decided to spend a bit of your afternoon with us to talk about the why, but also the how of the life of the mind, the humanities, the liberal arts, the classics. I think this is a really timely conversation because there are a lot of conversations going on, questions about higher education, the educational curricula, and I'd like to start our conversation today talking about, again, the why the liberal arts, why are we here, why do we care about these ideas, what are some barriers to the liberal arts today, and then we'll turn to the really practical part of our conversation, the how might we get a classical education outside the classroom without uprooting our lives, our families, quitting our jobs, going back to school. That's not really feasible for many of us. Yet these ideas, these books, the great conversation hold such high promise to improve each one of our lives, how we engage, how we move forward in the world in strength. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to live our lives better and well by being exposed and engaging with these ideas. So excited to have you part of the conversation. We hope to learn just as much from you as as we offer some ideas as well. So excited to have your contributions at the end of this conversation. We'll leave the last 15-30 minutes for questions. And just for registering for this conversation, you've automatically been entered to win a copy of James Hankins' latest book. Virtue Politics is a wonderful, wonderful book about the power of ideas, of a liberal arts education to transform society, transforming our leaders, making them noble and just, and transforming society from the bottom up, but also the top down. And so I've really been nourished by this book, and I hope you will too. There will be 2 lucky winners on this call today of James Hankins' book. And you've also been entered to win a year subscription to the teaching company's Great Courses Plus, which is, we'll talk about this today, but that's actually how I got my classical education. I didn't do it in school. My classical education happened exclusively outside the classroom. And the teaching company, there are incredible great courses across disciplines, not just the classics, but offer great promise, great opportunities to keep learning, keep nourishing your mind outside of school, outside the classroom. So everyone has been entered in to win Dr. Hankins' book and also a year subscription to the teaching company's Great Courses Plus. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to Jim. Tell us about why are we here? Why do we care about the liberal arts? Why do we care about the humanities, the classics, and what's the difference between all of these different disciplines? You mentioned there's a difference between the liberal arts, the humanities, the classics. Let's parse that, and then why do they matter?
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. The liberal arts and the humanities are not the same thing. The liberal arts were invented in antiquity. Artes liberales is a Latin term which refers to the education of basically aristocrats in the ancient world. Translates the enkycleos paideia of the Greeks, which was invented, I think, basically in the 4th century BC, also as a kind of training for future public leaders, future leaders of society. The humanities are an invention of the Renaissance, effectively invented by the great scholar poet Petrarch in the middle of the 14th century. But they became a kind of movement, the humanities movement, the Studium Humanitatis, which you can translate the study of humanity or as zeal for humanity. And that was more of a transformational program, interested in improving character. The famous 7 liberal arts of antiquity were skills: grammar, logic, rhetoric, mathematics, arithmetic, mathematics and astrology and music, and the quantitative studies to train your mind. But the humanities are meant to improve your character, and they study, what they add to the curriculum is history, poetry, and moral philosophy. Moral philosophy and humanity and liberal arts have been on different tracks entirely in antiquity. What the humanities do is they bring them together, and they formally study history and poetry more than antiquity. Antiquity studied poetry basically as a source of good language, whereas the humanities of the Renaissance study poetry as inspiration for noble and great behavior. So that's the difference. Now, why one would study these things is a different question. But just the liberal arts, I think in particular, people forget that they're actually very practical. I think today people often think of the liberal arts as a kind of luxury good, that if you go to college and you take a liberal arts, you're not advancing your career. You're maybe sharpening your mind in some vague way, or giving yourself culture, but you're not actually, it's not a careerist move to take a philosophy course, which by the way is quite wrong. But it's a general impression that the humanities and the liberal arts are not useful. But I think most of the history of the liberal arts and humanities, they've been regarded as extremely useful and something that you really couldn't do without. If you think of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, what are you learning? You're learning how to speak correctly, how to speak precisely so that other people understand you, which is not an easy skill, how to speak powerfully, effectively, how to convince other people, how to persuade other people. And the humanists of the Renaissance thought that if the leader was not persuasive, they would have to use force. So that's one reason to be persuasive, to bring people over to your mind so you don't simply have to go out and pass laws and enforce them. And then, of course, logic is an indispensable skill as well. You have to be able to think clearly as well as to speak clearly. And I think it's really been a tremendous fault in modern humanities education that we don't, liberal arts education, we don't pay enough attention to these basic skills, which are extremely important to our societies. And the great thing about traditional liberal arts and humanities is they paid a great deal of attention to language, right? What I spent all my time in classical studies doing in high school and college is translating texts, right? We sat down and read Cicero or Virgil, and we translated it. And it sounds like, it sounds very much like a waste of time, a luxury. But it's also a tremendous intellectual skill to be able to take something in another language and translate precisely into your own language. And if you think about international affairs, the importance today of communicating among different groups, and the fact that English is a lingua franca. I just heard my housekeeper in cleanly talking English, one's Brazilian, one's Thai. They use English, and be able to use English precisely is a hugely important thing to do. That you shouldn't get the impression, by the way, that I'm very wealthy. It's just that I need help with things like that in my life. So humanities is very useful. We don't need the quantitative humanities as much as we used to, or I should say the quantitative humanities, the quantitative liberal arts, mathematics, sciences, and so forth are kind of blossomed out on their own. But the language part of the humanities is extremely important. I would also argue that the addition to the liberal arts that the humanities makes in the Renaissance is also vital for our well-being. The study of poetry, history, moral philosophy, and oratory. They often study oratory as well, great speeches of the past. These are very important to our well-being, in part because history in particular, I think, gives us a kind of practical wisdom that we don't get from other sources. I was watching Victor Davis Hanson on this channel just to prepare for the talk, and I saw that he has the same attitude towards history that I do, that it's a tremendous source of comfort when you see the horrors and the diseases, mental and cultural diseases of our time, and you know that this has happened before, right? We've had these kind of problems before. And what history gives you, and it's very important for political prudence, is to know what's valuable and what's not valuable, what's permanent, what's not permanent. Have we had this before? Is it survivable? A lot of people went crazy over COVID when it first happened because they simply had no idea what it was going to mean. Is the world going to be wiped out? And I wrote an article back then about the Black Death, trying to point out that Black Death was a little more serious than as serious as COVID is. This is nothing on the order of the Black Death, right? So history gives you this kind of perspective. Poetry, I think, was valued by the ancients, in partly because it was memorable, right? It was in verse and it stuck in your mind. And I can still remember lines of verse that I learned as a Latin verse that I learned in middle school and high school that we had to memorize. Our teacher made us memorize phrases, lines from poetry and phrases. And I at the time, of course, being teenagers, we said, well, we have to memorize all this stuff for, what good is that? And now at the age of 66, I realize that my teacher did a good thing for me, because I still remember these phrases, and they're actually quite comforting, and they provide you with some kind of order. I'm talking to you, so I should let you respond to what I've said so far.
I thank you. No, that's wonderful. You're absolutely right about memorization. That's a part of the educational tradition we definitely have lost in our modern era. And I love what you said, Jim, kind of tracing the lineage of this idea of the humanities, liberal arts. You talked about paideia in ancient Greece, how this was like character formation, the educational curriculum that all Greek male citizens were expected to undergo, and that it found expression in ancient Rome in the humanitas, in the studia humanitatis, the liberal arts, the liberal art, that Cicero unpacked, and that they drew from Roman literature and also exclusively Greek literature. The Greeks, of course, were pretty primarily interested in Greek literature. Romans were interested in Roman and Greek literature, and then that found expression, that same idea, in the Renaissance with humanitas. And one of my favorite things that you've written, Jim, is that essay for First Things about the forgotten virtue, how humanitas for the Renaissance humanists like Petrarch was again using this curriculum of poetry, of rhetoric, of philosophy to kind of soften the soul, order the loves, and cultivate a love of others, a love of humanity, and soften the rougher edges of our soul. And that expression is civility. That's and talk about relevant to our modern era today. As someone who's writing a book on civility, I've really been nourished by your work, looking at how this concept and educational curriculum and tradition has been important to fostering just humane interactions with people. Like, life in society is hard, it's difficult. Like, we're we're selfish but social, and things, it's difficult to balance those two aspects of our nature and do civilization together. And this mode of education that has nourished people for thousands of years helps us balance those aspects of our nature, mitigate the selfish, the social can flourish, and that we can live in harmony and community together. So I love what you said. I love that aspect of your work. So Anya, what do you think are some barriers to studying the humanities, studying liberal arts, studying the classics today?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, I think, that was even addressed by James with regards to how it's perceived, that people think it's not going to be practical, that it's something that's just leisure. We'll talk about leisure as a concept later, I'm sure, but that it's something that people don't need. And you know, that's one of the things that we always try to do with classical wisdom, is to show the relevance, and that even in a very practical way, if you're studying logic, you are either in school for philosophy or mathematics, that it's often the premise for even STEM sort of research. And I often like to talk about rhetoric, the importance of it. It's great to learn how to speak eloquently and to convey your points and be able to have conversation with your family and friends without getting into huge fights. But it's also really important to notice when rhetoric's being used on you. And I always like to remind people that, because once you start seeing those devices, you can see how people, to be honest, can be persuaded into things that they might not even be realizing they're persuaded. And to be a good citizen, to be part of a community, it's very important to be defensive of when people are using those against you. But I think back to your question about barriers, I think, you know, we do have a bit of a trend at the moment, which is downplaying the importance of ancient history. And I realize that there's a lot of things and elements in ancient history that don't match our current modes of how we expect society to act, social equalities and such, and very important issues. And these are important issues, but I think it's important to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and to pick the very important elements in ancient history and Renaissance, and to find the elements that are transcendental, that are part of our humanity, that improve our humanness.
Yeah, if I could just make a point. I mean, people today complain about elements in ancient world which do not fit our current sets of values. But we also have to remember that the ancients had many values that were missing in our modern world. This was actually the inspiration for the Renaissance. People realized that there was something missing in their culture. They were reading, you know, Plutarch and Livy and all these noble Romans and Greeks, and they said, where is that nobility today? You know, where are those values today? Where's that love of country today? So we can, you know, it's not just that we should present ourselves as the censors of antiquity. We should present ourselves more humbly and say, look, what did the ancients have that we don't have anymore? We have the idea of progress, of course, has poisoned this whole allegiance to tradition and love of the past, because a false idea of progress makes us believe that we're better than the ancients, right? That we're always going to be, we have better science, so that makes us better generally. But there's a kind of parallel to the 14th century, because the 14th century had a belief that we have Christianity before the humanists, that we have Christianity, so that makes us superior to the ancients, right? The pagan ancients. And then people like Petrarch came along, who was a very sincere and deeply reverent Christian, who says, yes, we have Christian truth, but there's still stuff in the pagan world that we don't have, and we need to get it back. And our world is falling apart because we don't have those things anymore. We don't know what true nobility is. That was a term of art in the period. We don't know what true nobility is. The idea of a high purpose and the idea of human excellence that's placed at the service of other people, right? The idea of total loyalty to the community and selflessness, all these things. People in Petrarch's generation are looking around and saying, where are they? We're Christians, yes, we're saved. We have Christian grace, God's grace, but we're not acting very well. We're not behaving very well. It's not transforming us in the ways that we would like. So we need help. We want to go back to the ancients for that reason, right? That the ancients did a lot of stuff better than we did. This is the 14th century. Today the issues are different, obviously, but there's still a lot that the ancient world has to offer us that we're missing.
I completely agree, and this kind of brings back to what I was saying about rhetoric, but that I think most people can agree that we don't have many statesmen or stateswomen left. We only have politicians. And there is a big difference between people who are just catering for public opinion and just to be elected and just want power. And there are so many of those now. And it's tragic because, like you said, where are the Ciceros? What we need to bring back a culture where people not only realize that there is something like a statesman, that it's different from a politician, but that we as the people should expect that somebody needs to live up to that, and we should have our standards higher for the people that we want to be running whatever country we happen to be in.
Yeah, I agree, and I actually think that there are more people out there who, even politicians, who have good motivations, are civically minded. They want to improve their countries, but the structure of incentives is so different nowadays that those people are not rewarded. I mean, one of the great advantages the British have is that they have the honor system, right? And it's been corrupted, obviously, and there's lots of honors given out to people who donate to parties and so forth. But there's still, I've noticed this living in England in various periods of my life, that there is the British elite. It has in the back of its mind that it would like to have a knighthood, or a lordship or something like that. And that holds them to a certain standard of behavior, right? Because you can't get huge scandals and expect to get that. And they want to serve their country, or at least they want to serve enough to get the honors. We don't have anything like that in the US, and the rewards are quite different. We reward celebrity rather than service and those kind of things. But that's something, again, we could definitely learn from the ancients, especially the Romans, who are very good at rewarding, and the Greeks too, I think, were very good at rewarding people who served their country and served their city. And those people had honor, right? This is a concept that the ancients had that we are kind of, we are contemptuous of today. What's the term I'm looking for? When we think about honor, we think of something that's, old-fashioned, something your grandfather might have cared about, or something that people in the military care about, but it's not helping you to improve your GDP or improve your bank account at all. But honor is very important. It's something that we have to study the ancients to find out how they did that, because it's not going to come from people saying, I'm a bad person and I need to be a good person. Many of us have had that kind of conversion experience at one point in our life. We say to ourselves, look, my behavior is not good. I need to do something about it, and maybe the classics can help with that. But I think more importantly, that we have to understand the world of the classics and how, especially this concept of honor, was so important to eliciting good behavior on people, making people understand that, yes, I want to be good. I hate my bad person, I hate myself when I'm bad, but also there are rewards out there. Other people will recognize me and say, pat me on the head and say, that was very good that you gave money for this cause, or you served in this office. I don't think we have enough of that.
I think this conversation on leadership is really interesting, really important in the context of how to, at Civic Renaissance, we've been talking about what are the ingredients of cultural renewal, of revival, of a renaissance, essentially. And, we were talking about, like, today, where is Pericles? Like, we don't have the Medicis. Like, we have a lot of philanthropy. We have a really robust philanthropic network in America. The Tocquevillian civil society is extraordinary. We have a lot to be grateful for, but it's not as targeted, you know, intentional in cultivating the kind of character, soulcraft, the liberal arts that these leaders of Renaissance who led and presided over areas that had just unprecedented unlocking of human potential and ingenuity and innovation. And I think that's kind of what we're getting at here. How do we, in our daily lives, how do we cultivate our humanity and fulfill our human potential in our everyday? And so leadership is one kind of ingredient. Another one is leisure time. And I think that I've been polling a lot of Civic Renaissance members, and people just feel like they don't have the time. We're distracted, we're busy, we have jobs, we have kids, we have so much going on. We're pulled in a million different directions, and we're bombarded every second of our lives with things demanding our immediate attention. How do we kind of unplug and like just guard zealously time in our day and in our lives to think deeply and reflect and read deeply? And I want to hear from Anya on this. Yet I'd like to just share quickly a resource that I love on this book. It's a very short book, 50 pages, by a gentleman named Arnold Bennett. It was written in 1908. Kind of, and he's English, and so it's kind of in this cultural era where there's urbanization. People are slowly moving kind of off the farm and into the city and into white-collar jobs, 9-to-5 jobs. And he says very succinctly, like, to have an intellectual life, you have to create a day within a day. So think about it. You're 8 hours at work, you're an hour commuting. That leaves you, and you have to sleep at least 8 hours probably to be healthy, but that leaves you 7 hours to have a robust intellectual life. Like, he's like, take every single second of your life captive. Like, don't just fritter away time brushing your teeth for 20 minutes or, you know, just shooting the breeze. Like be intentional about how you use your time. I think we might have a lot more time than we think, he says. And he says to have, so like you have 7 hours outside of work, commute, and sleeping. And he's like, all you need to have a robust intellectual life is 90 minutes, 3 times a week of deep thinking and reading. That's it. And that's his like recipe. And then he says, start with poetry, and he has some poets that he loves. And then he's like, you know, anyone who doesn't like poetry really can't be helped. But it's just a really fun book. It's absolutely free on Project Gutenberg, but you can also, I have the hard copy because I like hard copies, but it's a really fun, easy breezy read that is just, it kind of like ignites your spirit. You're like, okay, yeah, I can do this too. So that's one kind of fun text that can encourage each of us with some techniques to kind of find more time in the very limited 24 hours we each have and are limited by in our everyday. What are some other ways that we can kind of create more time and more reflection for leisure? Anya, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's good timing, I must say, to keep talking about time. That today I'm actually releasing a podcast that I did with Zena Hitz, who wrote a book called Lost in Thought, and we just actually had a blast in this conversation, I must say. But talking about the concept of leisure and finding it, and one, I think, is just identifying what leisure is, what is meaningful time, and to prioritize it. So it's not being distracted. I'm sorry, watching football and drinking a beer doesn't count. You do need to do something that kind of gives a sense of meaning. And, you know, we discuss a lot of ways that you can try to figure out what that is, because it's different things for different people. It doesn't have to be just reading philosophy. It can be bird watching, it can be painting, it can be just playing music or singing, finding leisure time. It just has to be something that is more meaningful than just passing time. And I think part of that is to realize that we do pass a lot of time right now with social media, with, you know, the notifications and the badges and the bingings that go on in our life. And we all know this. We know this, that like you spend a half an hour on your phone and you put it down, you're like, ugh. Like everybody has that feeling. Nobody comes away thinking, wow, I'm so glad I spent that half an hour not reading a book or singing a song. You know, sometimes you do get meaningful interactions with people. There is connecting. There is finding interesting articles. You know, I'm not going to just trash the whole world, because I use it too. Everybody does. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't exist, but there is definitely times when we get home and we're just being lazy. But the thing is that when you do sit down with a book and or start picking up your guitar or just go for a walk and look at the birds, that can also be relaxing and meaningful at the same time. And even if it doesn't seem at first, I think that the problem was we're so uncomfortable with being bored for even that 1 second that we don't push past it to get to the really rewarding part where we gain from that time. And I'm not saying I'm perfect, don't worry. I do this too. I'm working on it.
There's a great line in Pascal where he says, all the troubles in the world come from people not being able to sit alone quietly in a room. Meaning that they have to find ways to occupy themselves, which don't have any kind of inner core to them. But it's funny you should mention Zena, because Zena and I actually were writing our books together in the same place. We were in Notre Dame. I got in a semester off. She got in a semester off at the Center for Ethics and Culture, and we took to having a meeting lunch every Friday to talk about our books. And we realized after a while that we were kind of working on different themes, because she was working on Scole, on cultivating the self apart from the demands of ordinary society, and I was working on how the Italian humanists I was studying were trying to instrumentalize, one might say, the humanities in order to transform society. So they were the kind of different projects and possibly antagonistic projects, and this kind of emerged over the course of weeks while we're having an hour lunch, and her book is going in one direction, my book's going in the other direction. But I think we came to a understanding between the two of us, and I'm very fond of her. She's a very good person. That both things are necessary, right? And not everyone's, the humanities and the liberal arts can be used to improve the quality of leadership. And the people who have had that training will be better leaders for that education. But that is not really what the life of the mind is about. The life of the mind is something that it's a contemplative life, right? This is what the concept of the ancients was, that there was an active life and a contemplative life. And the contemplative life for Aristotle should not be subordinated to the active life. The contemplative life was something that grew out of a well-ordered society, right? If you have a badly ordered society, you're worried about getting your house burned down, or getting beaten up by thugs or invaded by foreign enemies. So you need a well-ordered society, a well-run society. But when that happens, then you have the natural growth of the contemplative life, right? That the flower grows out of the good soil, and then you can have a fully flourishing human being. So the two things go together, but they're not really antagonistic. I think that they're complementary, in fact.
I love that. I love that. Just a note on your comment on Pascal, talk about a man ahead of his time. Like, he's talking before internet, before social media, before the printing press, really, even. And he's talking about how distracted we are, how prone we are to just like fritter our time away and not be disciplined, and how we're always looking for excuses to not just sit and be still and reflect. And I think you made an interesting point, how your project in Virtue Politics here, Jim, and Zena's project, Lost in Thought, kind of approach this from two different angles. I think that one problem today is that we have really made learning utilitarian. We have kind of instrumentalized it, where we're obsessed with efficiency. Like, why do we want good grades? To get into a good college. Why do we want to get into a good college? So we get a good job. Why do we want a good job? So we can have lots of money and impress our friends and have a house and have a car. Like, it's always a means to an end, as opposed to seeing learning as something, a joy in and of itself. And I think that's part of, why I'm excited to be having this conversation, that learning ought not end when we leave school. Like, part of being human is growing and cultivating like who we are, our self-awareness and our awareness of the world around us. Like, that's what, if we stop doing that, we don't just pause and plateau, we literally atrophy our minds and our bodies. And so I want this conversation to be an encouragement to each of us to keep growing, to keep nourishing our hearts, minds, bodies, and spirits through the life of the mind. But because it's good in and of itself, as Jim mentioned, and as the whole Virtue Politics Project says, that doesn't mean there are no external benefits to society. It doesn't mean that you're gonna have a harder time getting a job, or you're gonna have, a harder time making friends. But that's often how we kind of just think of things through the ends themselves, as opposed to seeing them as good in and of themselves. And one example of I think a really beautiful utilitarian approach to this, and again, on this theme of humanities outside of institutions, the liberal arts, the classics outside of institutions. Jim, you might have even known a gentleman named Earl Shorus. I don't know if that name sounds familiar to you. He has this beautiful essay in Harper's from like 1998 that I'll include after this conversation. By the way, everyone, we're going to have a full document that all of us, Jim, Anya, and I are going to put together of all the resources we're talking about, so you can take those home with you. A lot of Jim's amazing work, a lot of great resources that Anya has with classical wisdom, so you can all have that. And I'll include this essay. It's called "A Weapon in the Hands of the Restless Poor." This essay that Earl Shorus wrote. And he talks about how he was doing some sort of volunteer work in the prison system, and spoke to a woman about, what she wanted out of life when she was finally out of prison. And she goes, "I would really like to have a better understanding of the moral life downtown." And he goes, "What do you mean by that?" And she goes, plays and music and things like that. And he goes, "You mean the humanities?" And she says, "Yes, that I mean the humanities." And so from that conversation, it was kind of like an epiphany for him. And he started something that's still in existence today, called a Clemente course for the humanities, that is explicitly about educating low income and minority individuals in the humanities, because he has this famous line where the best education for the best is the best education for all. The humanities, the classics, have been the purview of the elite in society across history, because normally it's only the elite that have the time to cultivate their minds, to learn to read, to learn ancient languages. And most people in human history have had to survive. They've had to work, and it's been pretty much on subsistence level. And I've been reflecting on this question a lot. What does it mean for us today, where we're not basically all on subsistence level? We have more leisure time, we have more resources than any other, and more access to information and books and learning than ever before in human history. What might we do with that? How might we optimize these opportunities before us in this unique moment of time that we're in? And what might be, again, to this point of consequence, what kind of consequence could there be for a broader society if a quorum of each of us on this call choose to make the most of these opportunities, cultivate ourselves, and maybe we could even start a new civic renaissance. So I'd love to hear from you, Jim. What are some of these institutions that are cropping up, opportunities that people might be able on this call might be able to take advantage of, that are not credentialed? They're not credentialed institutions, they're not universities, and they're not credentialing, they're not giving you, a degree, they're not degree generating, but they're saying, they're welcoming people up through their doors and saying, you can learn these ideas will help you. So you just wrote a wonderful article, kind of looking at some of these institutions. Tell us about them, where they are, and what you've learned from them.
Okay, well, I became aware of this because I was invited to give a lecture at one of them at the Morningside Institute at Columbia. And they asked me to talk. It was, they think, the 100th anniversary of Columbia's contemporary civilization. And I went there and I was saying, and it's a humanities institute that is in the area of Columbia University and has Columbia students in it, but it's not connected with the curriculum in any way. And I went there with a question in my mind: why do they need to have a humanities institute at Columbia? Because Columbia is one of the best places in the country to study the humanities. Columbia and Chicago are the two heroes in the decline of American education. They're keeping these studies alive. And it turns out that there are a lot of people at Columbia and recently graduated from Columbia and professional schools who didn't get enough humanities, or felt that they hadn't been able to talk about the humanities in ways that they would have liked to talk in classrooms, because classrooms have gotten very political, as we all know. And they were afraid if they revealed their true thoughts, that they would be shut down or canceled. And so they wanted to go to a place where people were a little bit more tolerant, a little bit more open-minded, and because they're seekers, right? They kind of there are people out there who are seekers who don't know all the answers, and who want to come they want to have a core of beliefs that they really feel are their own beliefs, that they've thought through things, they've read great works of literature, they've read challenging philosophy and beautiful poetry, and there's something they value there. They want to be centered in that in some way, and they're not getting it in schools. So, because there's all the politicization going on, and of course, in many schools, they're just getting rid of the humanities as luxuries, or they're not bringing enough students and that kind of thing. So I was very moved by this place, and then I discovered that there's a whole network of them. I've come across now 22 of them, and they're at major universities, right? Harvard's got one called the Abigail Adams Society. Yale has one called the Elm Institute. There's one at Penn called Collegium Institute. There are two at Chicago, which is even more surprising. I gave a lecture at one of them called Lumen Christi, which is a Catholic foundation, but it's open to non-Catholics. There's Zephyr at Stanford. I can't remember all the names of them, but they're places where students and faculty who feel that they can't discuss freely the humanities the way they used to do, right? That they can do it there. I remember when I was a young teacher at Columbia, I taught contemporary civilization, which is the comically misnamed course that begins with the ancient Greeks and comes down to modern time. That it was assumed that you were going to read these books in order to give yourself a philosophy of life, right? That you would bang up against Plato and Aristotle and Hegel and Kant, and you would be able to to figure out where you stood and what you thought, and get some kind of we used to call it a philosophical position. Everybody had to have a philosophical position, and that was a good thing. It gave people dignity, right? People talk a lot about dignity today, but one thing that gives people dignity is to know where they think and what they believe and what they will accept and what they won't accept. So, but that's disappeared from universities. It's too dangerous if you're not simply if you're not simply parroting the whatever the current line is, and agreeing with everything you're told to agree with in universities, then you're in some kind of danger, or you feel yourself to be in danger, which may not be. And many people want another place to go. And since I published this article, I published it, I think it's maybe my most successful article online, because it got aggregated several places, Arts and Letters Daily and Powerline, a couple other places. I started getting emails from people who wanted to find where could they sign up, and also from professors who had recently retired or were older generation professors who remembered the good old days, right, when people could talk more freely and explore all their ideas, and maybe say a few of those words you're not allowed to say anymore. And they wanted to see if they, offer their teaching. That they would like to go to such a place and hold a seminar.
That's amazing. I love that.
Yeah, so I think that there is a need out there for this sort of institute.
And untapped potential. People that love this are subject matter experts and want to keep being a part of the conversation. So yeah. I want to turn to Anya and talk about, where do we start? Like, what do we read? Where can if we want to start today or tomorrow, Anya, where do we start? But really quickly, I want to share a little anecdote about a book I read this weekend about a time in history where the great books were kind of primarily outside of institutions. This book is called A Great Idea at the Time, and it's about the history of the great books movement at UChicago with Mortimer Adler and the UChicago president, Hutchins. And the whole idea was that this is for everyone. These ideas are for everyone. And so they put together 74 authors, and I think it was like 450 works, and put them in 75 volumes that I have on my shelf. You might be able to see some of them behind me there. And they sold 1 million sets between 1940 and 1960. They sold 1 million sets. That's 2% of the American population bought these sets. That's incredible cultural diffusion. So, like, one thing I love about Petrarch, our dear friend Jim, is that he was able to take, you know, great books, great ideas, and have it have incredible like cultural resonance and staying power. But I don't think he reached 2% of like the population of Europe at his day. I don't think it was that kind of widely disseminated kind of cultural influence.
Yeah, he invented the term great books, by the way, you know that.
I didn't know that.
The first use of that term is in Petrarch's preface to his one of his moral philosophy works, where he's writing to a ruler and telling him he needs to read great books. This is about middle of the 14th century.
I love that. I love that.
You know, the humanities originally, they did not start in the university. They started outside. It's the same as Mortimer Adler's great books, right? They started outside the university.
Yeah.
They started in private schools and in private study, and eventually they only came into the university, started coming into the universities about 1420s. But before that, there was a private education. So, and I think that's maybe what's going to happen now is we have to move out of the universities again, because universities are becoming hostile ground for humanistic studies in the best sense of that word.
Right. So that, and it's interesting that there were, of course, criticisms of the Great Books Project at the time, even from people who loved the great books, like Alan Bloom and Lionel Trilling at Columbia, famous literary critic. They were very critical of like the commercialization and democratization of the great books and great ideas. And there were criticism that the people who bought these books just wanted them as like decorative things on their shelves and never actually read them. There were criticisms that they had like archaic science texts like Ptolemy that is interesting as like an archaeological artifact, but not really relevant to like modern science. And of course, criticisms that we're all very familiar with today, that it was exclusively dead white men and no women. And so in the 1990s version, they did include some women, George Eliot, Jane Austen, which is, you know, a step in the right direction. But I think it's interesting to learn about this kind of era of our recent history, a time where these great books and these great ideas, the great conversations did have widespread cultural diffusion. Learn from what they did well, and learn from like how can we improve on what they achieved as well, and what would we do differently. Of course, Anya is always quick to remind me that Sappho was on par with Homer in the ancient world, and so there's so many aspects of like the classics are not a monolith. There's lots of diversity that we can draw from to incorporate and diversify the core and the great conversation, and lots of things that we can do better and improve as we try to have this conversation. But how do these ideas matter today, and how might they help us live our lives better? And so I love that example. But interestingly, did you come across the basic seminar at UChicago, Jim, in your kind of survey of these? So that's kind of one of the only places at UChicago that is still the great book. And that's the basic seminar is only for adults that want to get a great books education. It's a 4-year curriculum where, you know, you start reading Homer and you kind of work your way through the canon, and it's, you know, you pay and you get a liberal arts certificate, but it's like kind of quasi credentialed, but that's the place where you can still get a great books education. Another kind of resource for maybe
a number of great books universities around the country, and the famous one is St. John's, where Zena Hitz teaches.
Yeah,
right?
That's where I went.
You go to St. John's? That's great.
Yeah.
They have Mortimer Adler's curriculum basically still there with, you know, changes and this and that, but and there's another St. John's, I believe, in New Mexico. Is that right?
Santa Fe.
Santa Fe. And there are other places that teach great books curriculum as part of it. So you can do it in college if you want. But I think the problem is that the large universities, the more prestigious universities, decided that this is no longer what they want. They're the elites that they train to know, and fortunately, the students themselves are a little bit more smart than their administrators are, and they know that they really should not graduate from Harvard or Yale without having read Plato and Shakespeare. And, you know, they come to our courses where I teach this stuff at Harvard, and they understand that this is what educated people should know, right? And you can't have a conversation with a well-read person and not be having to get out your cell phone to look up who Shakespeare is. I'm pretty sure that most members of the U.S. Congress who have heard the name of Shakespeare could not name the century in which he lived. Right.
That's depressing. That's a pessimist.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
People
Maybe
say
not wrong,
they thought it was 19th century. They got it confused with Jane Austen. But I'm being sarcastic and annoying and arrogant, so I shouldn't stop that.
So,
Wait, can I just, sorry,
Yeah.
can I just interrupt and say, though, we have quite a lot of questions from the audience, and we're almost out of time. So I fear that the three of us could probably chat for quite a few hours, but we might need to, at some point, direct some questions to you guys, if that's possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just going to say also that with regards to the institutions and such, I was actually having a phone call the other day with Stephen Blackwood, who's running Ralston College, which is another program where they're trying to set up the classics outside of the classroom and do courses and such. And he had a very optimistic note, which was, hey, there is a need, a demand right now for people looking for something more substantial. So what we need to do is find ways that we can provide this for people and make sure that they know that there's options for more substantial education and philosophy and literature, and that these are available. And I think there are many institutions beyond just the ones that you mentioned, James, but even just more informally, like for people who are interested in philosophy, modern Stoicism is a growing movement. And I know Alexandra and I are both friends with Donald Robertson. He's done a lot of great work with showcasing how that ancient philosophy can be helpful for people today. There's many wonderful podcasts as well, so you can turn your commutes into more useful time. I do a lot of things with the host of the Ancient Greece Declassified. There's also more interactive things like Clubhouse, and there are a lot of movements. I think even for the younger generation, people are searching for something more meaningful than maybe what they're starting to realize that they've been given. And so I think for people who love ancient history and philosophy and the Renaissance, it's sort of our job, I think, to make sure people know that there are solutions, ancient solutions to universal questions and problems. But if I may, I'd like to jump into at least a couple of these questions because I feel our audience has been writing in from the very beginning, and I would like to make sure they get to say something. So this first one is, you mentioned finding comfort in history, knowing that these things have happened before. Is that not a cause for regret that the lessons don't appear to be learned?
Yes. The short answer is yes, but it is possible. I think the human race, is there's a great line of Martin Luther, who says that the human race is like a man who gets up on a donkey, he falls off, he gets back up and falls off the other side. Meanwhile, the donkey's still moving, so you're kind of making progress, but by fits and starts. I think that the idea that human history has got is making progress towards greater happiness and greater fulfillment is wrong. We make greater progress towards the mastery of nature, and I think also make very good progress in feeding people and things like that in the world of material happiness. But we're not making much progress in terms of the higher parts of human nature, and I think that's the nature of things, the nature of the beast, of the human beast. But it is still possible to learn from history, and I think that it's important to our mental health to study history, just because we need to know. What my friends say, we need to study history because we need to know when to panic. But usually, I think that would be when the asteroid comes to strike the planet. Otherwise, we can cope.
I think that's an excellent point, and Zena and I actually talked about what to do if an asteroid hits in the podcast. I said maybe we should all be preppers, and maybe that's so this is actually a comment, and then I'll go into the next question, which I think is a bit more involved. I place a lot of weight on ideas and wisdom that have survived for 2,000 plus years. I love to teach my 8th graders about the Stoics, show how this philosophy runs through it in history. We see it in Frankl and the power he gains in choosing his response in the face of the horrors of the Holocaust. Recently, I've discovered Montaigne. Your book, Dr. Hankins, sounds like a perfect continuation of my studies. Just added Bennett's book to my to-be-read pile as well. And there's quite a few questions for more details on Bennett's book. So I think that will also be in the follow-up to the email that goes out. And then there's another couple of questions that talk about, I guess, some of the accusations happening right now with the classics, both in regards to being seen as a tool of white supremacy, to this question, which is, there have been several opinion pieces on the decision by Howard University, a historically black college, to cut out its classics department. The argument, among others, is how important the classics have been to African American authors, politicians, et al. The language and words from the classics help them to fight for equality. What are your thoughts about that?
Question for me. Well, I have to say that I think it's a huge mistake at Howard University. And the reason I say that is because we have at Harvard in the last few years had a number of students from Philadelphia Classics Academy, which is a classics academy basically for minorities in northern Philadelphia. And these are black students basically, but they know Latin and Greek, and they're kind of terrifyingly intelligent. But also, you know, since classics was for a very long time and may still be an education that was proper to the upper classes, knowing the classics for these young black kids is tremendously, it really gives them a kind of strength and a kind of confidence that they might not have coming to Harvard and realizing that they know a hell of a lot more, excuse my language, a lot more Latin and Greek than the guy from Exeter, right, or the guy from Phillips Academy who's sitting next to them in class. They can always out snob them, right? Even though they come from North Philadelphia and from the school. So I'm a great believer, and this is also a good Renaissance phenomenon, right? That the classics ennoble you. This is where the whole, this is the idea of the true nobility comes from, that there are people who consider themselves noble because of their lineage, because of their wealth, but the true nobility is the nobility of the person who has knowledge, who has virtue, who has ability. So I think when universities are doing away with classics programs, that they're taking something away from people that they really need.
And one thing I'd add to that, I mean, not having a grounding in the classics limits our ability to engage with some incredible civil rights leaders, like Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. Like, he was incredibly classically learned. He mentioned Socrates 3 times. He paraphrases Augustine, that unjust law is no law at all. He invokes Aquinas. Like, these are core figures of the great conversation, of the wisdom of the human tradition. And I mean, ultimately, and this is a theme I explore in my book on civility, that the classics, again, they humanize us, they make us more humane, they cultivate that aspect of our humanity, and they diminish that desire that Augustine had the phrase libido dominendi, the lust to dominate others. Like, we have that it's in our nature as human beings. We want to dominate others, and that's in all of us. And that these ideas that in cultivating our humanity help us see that human beings are things to be like cherished, and they declare the irreducible dignity of and and the vibrancy of the human person. Dignity, of course, was central to the Italian Renaissance as well. Pico della Mirandola's oration on the dignity of man, that we are the primacy of God's creation, because we have free will, and that's part of our nobility. And that was a huge influence on why it was of utmost importance to cultivate ourselves to the fullest. That was an expression of how we celebrated God. So I agree with Dr. Hankins, with Jen. There's a lot to be missed in omitting this important part of the human tradition from our educational system.
Yeah, I always think of Phyllis Whitley as well, the young woman who was a slave back in, I think it was the 1500s, who was the first African woman to be, or African American woman, I guess she was born in Ghana, so maybe still African, to be published in America in the UK for her poetry. And she was very well read. She was still a slave at the time, in Greek and Latin, and quoted, Epictetus as a fellow slave as an inspiration. And so it's a very amazing story of how she was influenced by the classics. I have a few comments with regards to, James, your point about the British honor system, from Brits, no doubt. So as a Brit, I believe that the honor system has been increasingly degraded and corrupt in ancient years and should be abolished. I think it was a comment that it's not abolished, then at least rebranded. Its current form is unpleasantly imperialistic.
Well, I don't know very much about the British honor system, but I have noticed that that a lot of people in universities are thinking about that as a possible set of letters to go after their name. But I guess I would vote in favor of rebranding or reforming. And I understand. I've read enough. I read The Spectator quite often. I'm aware that that it's a highly politicized and also corrupt honor in some cases. I don't know. I don't want to say the whole thing is that way, but I think it's possible. There are other ways to give good public servants recognition, but I think it is very important that societies have some way of showing that this person has done well, has served the republic, as we'd say in our country, served the monarch, but also that their behavior has been admirable, and that this is the type of person who can be held up as a model. Because this is another thing we didn't talk about, but one of the things we certainly need is more good models, right? People who really can. This was understood ages ago that athletes, famous athletes, were supposed to behave well. This is, a long time ago, but when I was growing up in the 1960s, it was, I think it was shocking if a major athlete who was on every baseball card, right, or many baseball cards, if that person, got divorced or, beat up somebody. Now it's kind of, a daily occurrence of sports figures, but there was a sense, maybe I'm romanticizing, but there was a sense, or maybe I didn't know about the bad apples. Maybe they were covered up by the press, but there was still an idea that a sports figure had a lot of young boys, and I guess girls too, looking at him or her, as we'd say, but mostly it was him in my youth, and who were expected to live up to a standard. And there are a lot of people don't have that. I don't know where it's gone, but I think honor is a large part of it. People have the sense that I have to be a certain kind of person because of my position in society. I am not the kind of person who does that sort of thing, right? And if I do that sort of thing, I will be letting down my institutions. If I behave in a certain way as professor at Harvard, then I'm letting down the institution, and I'm destroying its prestige, destroying its ability to change other people's lives in a good way. So I'm not going to pursue the Harvard analogy very far because we run on the rocks quite soon. But nevertheless, I think the sense that people owed something to the institutions to behave in a certain way, and they had loyalty to those institutions, That, Yuval Levin wrote a book about this not long ago, I think, called A Time to Rebuild, I think, where he was talking about the need for institutions to be inhabited by people who believed in those institutions and behaved in certain ways in order to support them. There are a lot of parasites in our institutions, people who think that they can behave any way they like and the institution will take care of them. They can destroy the curriculum. They can tear the place apart and the institution will still last. My message is the institution is not going to last. Even if it's got, $40 billion like Harvard, the institution can be destroyed by people who don't live up to the standards of that such an institution should uphold.
I totally agree with the comments of honor. And I might say that I think it's still alive in the public, that they still recognize it. And just as like a very kind of maybe funny anecdotal one, I'm down here in Argentina, and I've been here when Maradona died. And so if anybody follows football or soccer, that Maradona is an extremely famous Argentine football player, quite a controversial character. But when he died, there was drugs, and he wasn't particularly a good person. And so I'm sitting in a taxi with the taxi driver when the news of this, iconic figure in this country dies. And I'm like, oh, how do you feel? And he goes, he wasn't a particularly nice person. Messi, however, who's probably one of the most famous soccer players in the world right now, he's like, he's a family man. He's a good guy. Like, he's somebody you can cheer for. And I was like, wow. So, I think to the person on the street, they still recognize the value in that honor, even if the people who are in the public eye don't realize the importance of it. But I want to move on, just a comment and then a question. One is, as a rocket scientist, I have found that my education has been deficient, and I appreciate the conversation that is occurring about the humanities. Thank you. So I love that no matter where you have been in your life, that in the end of the day, I think the humanities does contribute something. And this question I'd actually like to ask you, Alexandra, because I know this is something you've discussed a lot with Eric Adler in the Battle of Classics, but do you think that our dismissal of the past is in relation to our putting science and technology above all? Maybe this is a good question to do back to back with the rocket scientist. We see those of the past as being naive and unsophisticated, as they did not have the technical knowledge we possess.
It's a great question that really gets to the heart of a lot of our problems in modern society today. C.S. Lewis had the phrase chronological snobbery, where we think that we're constantly improving and that anything that's come before us is just better and deficient, morally, societally, technologically. There's a French thinker, Jacques Ellul, who has an incredible book called The Technological Society. And by technological society, he doesn't mean technology like our iPhones. He means techne, the Greek word for knowing and making, and how we have become obsessed with knowing and making, and that we've become obsessed again with efficiency and utility and bureaucracy, that all of these things reduce our humanity. After I left the U.S. Department of Education, I was absolutely devastated and disillusioned and broken, because I was told for a year of my life that beauty and goodness and truth didn't matter. And that basically, I was surprised that the Department of Education didn't care about education, and because they didn't care about the things that I had been educated in that were valuable and told to be valuable my entire life. And I read a lot of Max Weber after I left the Department of Education. His essay on bureaucracy helped me understand why. Part of why I was very unhappy is because a bureaucracy is a big machine. Weber is the one that coined this word, cog in the machine, that human beings become like a subordinate to the broader institution and organization. And we don't even, people become part of a larger thing that they don't understand the why of. And I think that is relevant to a lot of education today, that we, take tests and complete core curriculum requirements and check boxes, but we've lost the why of education. And the why of education is understanding who we are, what our purpose is in the world, and what it means to be human, and what the good life is. And without that, we are not enabled to to do this thing called life and society very well. We're very handicapped in our ability to do that. So Jacques Delisle, I'll add that to our list of resources. Modern kind of critique of modern society. Wonderful book. But really appreciate that question. Thank you.
Maybe this should be our last, so we don't go too over time. Is the liberal arts versus humanities distinction both true and, in a common sense, a distinction without a difference in the following way? That is, do the liberal arts focus on the acquisition of skills while exposing the human heart and mind to humane letters, whereas the humanities, at least its literary component, works in a reverse way, focusing on formation while acquiring skills?
Well, there are two historically distinct traditions, right? The liberal arts was inherited from the Greeks. It's refashioned by the Christians into 7 liberal arts in the 5th century BC. There are, Cicero talks about the studies of humanity as opposed to the study of divinity, but for him, he's talking about things below the moon and above the moon. Basically, it's a disciplinary distinction. But the Studium Humanitatis is meant to change character, which is not to say that the liberal arts did not change character. Okay, I think this is the point that the questioner is really getting to. If you read Quintilian, who's our major source for ancient Roman education, also Cicero's De Oratore, they are very concerned with the moral character of the orator, who is the ancient name for statesman. But the educational system is not designed to produce good moral character. You would have a philosophy to do that. Cicero was an academic skeptic, but he was very much influenced by Stoic philosophy in particular. It's philosophy that was supposed to change your character. The educational system was really not intended for that. It was intended to fit you to be a statesman. But this is what the humanists of the Renaissance were trying to change. They were trying to make the educational system improve the character of human beings. And they were reshaping the curriculum. That's why they brought in moral philosophy, because moral philosophy was never part of ancient education. If you wanted to study philosophy, you went to Greece and you sat under a master, or you brought a master to Rome and studied with that person. It studied poetry, but in a very early stage in order to improve your diction. And it didn't study history at all formally. Everyone read history, but it wasn't part of the education. What you read was Sallust. You read the short historical essays of Sallust, but they were read for style. And there might have been an assumption there that you would osmose the moral character of Sallust, which not necessarily going to be anybody. Or the moral examples in Sallust, but it wasn't taught as a school of prudence the way of prudence the way it is taught in the Renaissance in a very explicit way. The first professor of history didn't exist till the 16th century.
Wow, that's amazing. I had no idea.
The first art of history, where you talked about how to write history, is from the late 15th century. So it's not part of the curriculum in the way that other studies are.
That's fascinating. I think we should probably leave on that point, because I'm sure everybody's starving and ready for lunch. But I want to say thank you very much. And everyone, please check out Dr. Hankins' book, Virtue Politics, Soulcraft, and Statecraft. We will be sending out a link to that as well, so you can purchase it, read it, check it out, because I think you'll find it extremely valuable, worth use of your leisure time. We do have a lot of questions still, so I will send them to our fantastic panelists to see if we can answer some of them in the follow-up email. And I also want to say thank you very much, Alexandra, for your excellent moderating and participation. And everyone, please check out Civic Renaissance, wonderful newsletter dedicated to truth and beauty, which I think is something we can all agree is a valuable use of our time. And I just want to leave with 2 comments that we have 2 more events coming up in the next month. The next one is actually on sex, soldiers, and thieves with James Romm, Paul Cartledge, and Helene Foley. And then afterwards, I'm doing another event with Alexandra. If you want to tell everyone about that, so they can join as well.
Absolutely. We are having a conversation with Christopher Salenza. He's a dean at James Hopkins University, and he's a biographer and a scholar of Petrarch, Francisco Petrarch, who's come up a number of times during this conversation because he's very central to this question of how to popularize, how to revive the humanities, the great conversation, and great books. I didn't realize he coined that term. I love that. And so that will be the theme of that conversation then, and it'll be a continuation of this question of how to get an education in these ideas, maybe outside the university, or interestingly, Salenza noted that Petrarch was responding to a very utilitarian and bureaucratic university system of his day that had become very scholastic and very kind of obscure and disconnected from the real world, and he was responding against that. So lots of insights to learn from Petrarch's life that are relevant today.
Wonderful. Thank you again, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful, wonderful day.
And we will draw copies for James Hankins' book and the winners for his book, and also the great courses this week, and we'll be in touch. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. If you would like to learn more about the resources mentioned in this email, please go to classicalwisdom.com/classics outside the classroom. You can find Dr. Hankins' book, Virtue Politics, Soulcraft, and Statecraft on Amazon.com or at hup.harvard.edu, and you can sign up for Alexandra's free newsletter at civic-renaissance.com.